friends, and welcome once again to Modeling from Zero, a video series brought to you by AK Interactive. In today's video, we will go over 3 very important topics. First of all, we will see how to apply a base coat using an airbrush. Secondly, we'll dive headfirst into color modulation, looking at how we can highlight the coat of paint we've previously applied and turn our scale model into a significantly more visually striking object. Last but not least, we'll add decals to our models so that we can then move on to weathering in a future video. No need to worry if you don't have an airbrush. We hope that this video will still teach you a thing or two about concepts and serve as a visual guide for you to start understanding how light behaves on our scale models so that we can make them more visually attractive. And in future videos, we'll do the same with a paintbrush. So sit tight and enjoy! Here we have our test subject. You may remember this Sherman from priming it in the previous video. If you haven't seen that video yet, stop right now and go check it out. It's a controversial topic for some, so there's a good chance you'll end up feeling one way or another by the end of the video. And those of you who watched the video know that we used black microfill paint to prime this tank. The advantage is that it will provide great resistance, which we'll definitely put to the test during this video. And for the color modulation, we'll be using the World War II US Army Basic Color Set. This is a paint set from the Real Colors range by AK Interactive, and it includes 4 different paints. Their combination will allow us to modulate this vehicle. It will be important to mix the colors together to make the transitions between the different colors smoother and avoid sharp jumps from one tone to the next. However, if this happens, we can balance them out with a filter, which is another very important product that we'll see in a future video. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to modulation is that we are not mirroring real-life light. The results are not supposed to be completely realistic. Instead, our intention is to create stronger or more balanced contrasts that will draw our attention and make the scale model stand out and appear more attractive. After this little introduction, let's get to work, and we'll start by applying a base coat using the Olive Drab No. 9 paint with the thinner from AK Interactive. It's 3 parts paint and 1 part thinner. And when it comes to mixing and diluting, we must have a recipient nearby where we create the mixture before pouring it into the airbrush, so that we can check the viscosity and consistency beforehand, and this way avoid having to take apart the entire airbrush in case of an error. This additional step can save us a headache, especially when we're a beginner, and later on we can of course skip it over and do the mixtures directly in the airbrush. And now onto the actual painting. You can see that when applying the base coat, we must not rush. Take it slow and make sure to cover each part, each recess with the paint, and you can see that after covering the panel of the tank, we move on to a different area to let it dry and then return. The process of applying that first coat of paint is actually similar to how they paint bigger surfaces of vehicles in reality. Once you go over one area, you let it dry and then repeat the process. And with each additional coat, the color becomes more vibrant. So this is a tool, a technique that we can play with to achieve the right color tone that we want to see on our vehicle. In our case, we applied more coats of paint, as the intention was to achieve more vibrant and solid color to leave more room for weathering. Now that we've finished with the chassis, we'll move on to the turret. Using the Real Colors, as you can see next, we can achieve quite translucent coats of paint. This will come very handy once we have some more experience, allowing us to play around with very subtle coats of paint, just like here, where we can still see the black underneath the first coat. But as we said before, we want to cover the scale model completely with this Olive Drab No. 9, so that's what we'll do in this case. As I said at the beginning, this tutorial is a bit more advanced, just so you can see how we can simulate light and bring liveliness to our scale models. To achieve this, we're using an airbrush, but we will show you how to do the same thing, how to apply the concepts of light on our vehicles or figures using a paintbrush, as we're aware that many of you don't use or don't even have an airbrush at home. What we want is for you to internalize the concepts, how we can simulate the incidence of light on our scale models to make them more visually attractive. We are using this ZEP tray for holding all the wheels and the pieces and parts that are separate. You may remember the tray from the first video where we discussed necessary and helpful tools for scale modeling. And another handy tool is the toothpick that everyone has at home and that we're using here as a cheap holder for all these parts. We work on each piece individually, and once it's painted, we'll place it again in the holder tray. We're trying to avoid the pieces touching one another, although the paint dries fast, so this is not really a worry. Just be a little bit careful and avoid any rubbing of the different pieces that could result in the paint coming off. And finally, although we've applied a very solid coat of paint, as we said before, the paint itself is so thin that we can still see all the details and the serial number of the different parts. Now, before moving on to the actual process of modulation, let me explain to you what we're going to do, and for this demonstration we're using this part from Tiger. With the brush we've simulated the incidence of light, and now we're applying this white paint as if it were the light. We can use other objects as well to help us, like old credit cards or loyalty cards we've all gathered over the years and can now just use our phones instead. We separate the different panels and create this false sensation of the incidence of light. So now that we more or less understand the idea, we can grab the bottle with olive drab number 9 that we've previously applied to the interior of the chassis that would correspond to the black part in this experiment, and we'll mix it with olive drab faded. We'll use our previous mixture and add 1/3 of olive drab faded so that the transition is smoother. When working with surfaces that don't have many angles, we'll focus on highlighting the superior parts of the chassis. When we're trying to explain modulation, what it consists of, to someone who has no idea what it is, we compare the airbrush to a flashlight. When we're using light colors, we bring in flashlight closer to a specific piece. The closer we get, the more intense that fictitious light will be, and when we move away, the light will get more blurry. This means that depending on what results we want to obtain, we move the airbrush closer or farther away, and always keep in mind that we don't want to get too close to the piece, as this could result in spider webs, which could ruin our scale models. When we have gone over all the areas that are somewhat raised or that we want to highlight, what we sometimes like to do is apply a small coat of paint all over the surface with the airbrush far away, just to smooth out the transition between the coats. Notice the difference between the chassis and the turret. The difference is the modulation, and you can already see that the chassis looks brighter and more lively. So let's move on to the turret. We're focusing on the largest parts. Those we will highlight, and others, like the area where the two hatches meet or other smaller areas, we'll leave without modulation, as if keeping them in the shadow. All of this is much easier to do with German tanks, as they have stronger angles, so the results we can achieve with those tanks are more expressive. But we've opted for a Sherman, so this is what you get. At this point, it's not really important for us that you learn how to do this well, just that you can learn how to do it at all, and perhaps lose some fear that might be holding you back. We're using an old transport cart pretending it's the surface of the vehicle, and right now we're just trying out the new mixture for modulation, just to see if the transition from one coat to the next is too aggressive. We're adding a lot of olive drab faded. And you won't hear us talking about proportions right now, because the amount of the lighter color that we add to the mixture will depend on the results you want to achieve. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution. In this experiment, we apply some paint in the corner of the card and then dry it with a hairdryer. The difference is hardly noticeable. So, to highlight the green color, we'll add a little bit of yellow. You will learn all about this, about how to highlight the different colors in a future video about color theory. Then we'll show you how the different colors interact together to make them more or less bright, but in this case, in the case of the green color, just know that we can do so by using yellow. Another thing to keep in mind is that the brighter the color, the smaller the area where we should apply it. This is to say that with each new light that we add, we must reduce the application area. We've noticed that in the last video you've asked us in the comments to indicate percentages, the ratios for dilution. When working with real colors, the ratio we use is 3 parts paint to 1 part thinner. This is not a rule that works for everything, because the amount of thinner to use will depend on what our goal is. But in general, for this type of modulation and base coats, 3 parts paint and 1 part thinner is the way to go. Please keep also in mind that real colors can only be thinned using a specific thinner for lacquers. Do not use water or alcohol alone with them, as, to put it simply, the results won't be good. And continuing with the modulation, we're just repeating the same step, but each time the area of application becomes smaller. We definitely recommend you to use lacquer paints for this process, although it's not the only option, of course. But the advantage is that we didn't have to disassemble the airbrush not even once, which would be hard to achieve with acrylic paint, as it dries much quicker. So the conclusion to take from this is that there is a time for each tool and for each type of paint, and we can combine them all in one single scale model if we follow the correct steps and procedures. After this step, you can already see that we have highlighted the most prominent areas, and we'll just take it a bit further and go over the areas that we want to highlight a bit more. If you've made any error, that's fine, it can be solved later on. We've added a slightly more beige tone to the previous mixture and will apply one final highlight, very focalized light in some very small areas, if we want the modulation to be slightly more exaggerated. If it seems too much or too unrealistic to you right now, that's fine, we will be applying filters later, so the final result will be much more balanced. For the process of modulation, we definitely don't need to spend much money on an airbrush, if that's the option we choose. The one we've used throughout this video is Harder and Steenbeck Evolution Silverline, but there are more economical options that will do the job just as well. For example, you can check out the basic line airbrush from AK Interactive. And when it comes to the compressor, we're using one with a tank and applying 1.8 bar pressure. Although we can of course change the pressure depending on what we want to do. So once we've applied this last quite extreme highlight, we're happy with the results and can move on to the next step, which are the decals. What is the first thing to know about applying decals? That's very simple. We must use gloss varnish. This kind of varnish, gloss, is the most resistant option, and on top of protecting all the work we've already done on the scale model, it will also help us avoid decal silvering, which are the tiny air bubbles trapped under the clear decal carrier film. So, with that in mind, we prepare the gloss varnish. We typically dilute it in 50-50 proportion and apply it in several thin layers. After that preparation is finished, we pick up the decal sheet and see where the decals are supposed to go, and then we simply cut out a big enough piece to work with comfortably. To hold the decals, we can use these reverse action tweezers, and for cutting them out, of course, we have several options, like the new scissors from AK Interactive, or a hobby knife, like we're using here, that will let us cut with precision. We will need a bowl or a recipient with warm water, and we'll place the piece of the decal sheet that we've cut out inside until the decal itself starts to separate from the sheet. By applying some water where the decal is going to be placed, we can move it easily to find the right position. And now we grab some cotton balls or a Q-tip to remove excess water and any bubbles that may have formed in the interior of the decal. We'll repeat the same process with all the decals. Be patient and don't use any sharp objects that could harm the decal. If that happens, it's definitely a headache to solve, but keep in mind that it's not the end of the world. Nowadays, many brands can sell you replacement decal sheets, so just try to contact them if you break any decal and want to find some peace of mind. When the decal is in the correct spot, we'll set and seal the decals in place with some decal setter. When working with larger decals that are to be placed on different panels, and we must find a way to adapt the shape correctly, the process is the same. The only difference is the type of products that we use. For example, this star, used for differentiating light tanks from the air, is on 3 different panels, so we must adapt the decal to the surface. How do we do that? Using the decal softener. As you can see, we apply it all over the decal and let it take effect. Then, with the help of a paintbrush, we move it very carefully until it adapts to the surface. So now that the decals have integrated into the scale model, we apply a coat of matte varnish on top to set them permanently and to protect them so they don't come off under any circumstances. Now our tank is ready to move on to the next steps. This may have been a little more advanced lesson for some of you, but we wanted to show you how the light works on scale models, and in the future we'll show you how you can do this with a figure and using a paintbrush, which is certainly a tool that we all have at home. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this new episode of Modeling from Zero, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then!